The year is 1973, and a post-American graffiti George Lucas just hatched an idea for the ages after glancing at an old movie poster of a heroic character jumping from a horse to a truck. The image brought forth fond memories of the 30s Republic Pictures adventure serials Lucas loved watching as a kid. He was disappointed no one was making B-movies modeled after those serials anymore, and thus, Indiana Smith was born. It's now 1975, and Lucas brings the adventures of Indiana Smith to his friend, Philip Kaufman. While collaborating on the script, Lucas envisions the titular hero as a college professor by day and archaeologist adventurer by night, the origin stemming from Lucas's own love of archaeology. While not in the classroom, Smith was described as a frequent nightclub patron and womanizer. However, Kaufman had other ideas and scrapped the playboy persona, instead having the hero engage in fisticuffs with the Nazis over the Lost Ark of the Covenant. Fast forward to 1977, and Star Wars is about to debut to the masses, changing cinema forever. Lucas, fearful of its failure, vacations to Hawaii with his close friend Steven Spielberg, and the two begin discussing their next projects. Spielberg expresses interest in directing a Bond film. Lucas said, "I've got something better," and proceeded to pitch Spielberg on a trilogy of films following this archaeologist adventurer, Indiana Smith. Shortly after, Smith was replaced with Jones, Spielberg agreed to direct the project, and the rest is history. Raiders of the Lost Ark hit theaters on June 12, 1981. Despite minimal last-minute marketing, Raiders became the highest-grossing film of 1981 and a global phenomenon, raking in a grand total of $330.5 million worldwide. All of this occurred during a year where Superman 2 and Roger Moore's fifth James Bond film, For Your Eyes Only, was expected to dominate the summer blockbuster season. You think there was going to be a sequel? Yeah, it didn't take long before Lucas and Spielberg were back in the writing room, and the film that followed is perhaps one of the most fascinating, bold, experimental, and cathartic blockbusters ever put to screen. Perhaps that's why, over the years, it's become my favorite Indiana Jones movie. However, it wasn't always like that. Hey, how's it going, everyone? Griffin here from FilmSpeak, where we like to say the conversation continues after the credits, and of course, these video essays are a great way to continue that conversation. So be sure to stick around and subscribe to the channel for more content like this and more insight, analysis, and interviews behind your favorite movies. Welcome
to Jurassic Park.
No, not Jurassic Park. No, welcome to
the party, pal.
Wait, no, what? That doesn't even. Get out of here, Willis. We're not even talking about McTiernan. What do you do? Whose idea was this? Welcome to The Director's Project, a monthly playlist featuring creators across FilmTube who decided to get rowdy and discuss some of your favorite filmmakers. And who the hell else would we be starting things off here with for the month of November other than Papa Spielberg? Yes, we're going to be talking about the man, the myth, the legend, the father of blockbuster cinema, the only name in blockbuster cinema, the only name in filmmaking. After this video, we're not even going to talk about other directors. We're talking about Steven Spielberg. So please go support the work of my fellow creators who decided to participate in this month's collaboration by clicking the playlist right over there. And if you've got something to say about Spielberg, create your own video and then tweet it out to AJ from Prop Culture at Prop Culture. All right, now let's take a trip down the dark side and talk about why exactly I love Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Growing up, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was always the odd one out during our weekly rewatches of the trilogy. Raiders was the family favorite, though ironically I had to look away during the face-melting climax of that film, and my sister and I absolutely adored The Last Crusade. When it came to watch Temple of Doom, there was always some form of hesitation. No one was ever in the mood, and I was often told, "Oh, that's the worst one. We should just skip it. Yeah, don't bother with that one." So what did we do? We skipped it. I went several years before inevitably taking it upon myself to watch Temple of Doom one afternoon while I was home from school sick. I remember enjoying it for the most part. The nonstop action and spectacle of it was fun and exciting, but something was missing, or rather, there was something incredibly different about it. It was nothing like what I had come to expect out of an Indiana Jones movie. It was violent, graphic, horrifying, disturbing, and yet darkly comedic and playful. Temple of Doom was wacky and pulpy. It strived to be more than just a repeat of Raiders. It was very much its own thing, which is ironically why it feels so detached from the franchise. After that first viewing, I had many questions and shortly found myself having an odd fascination with the film. It became an almost obsession, actually. Why was it so different? How did two of the biggest names in blockbuster filmmaking get away with this? And yet, why am I enjoying every second of it? In the subsequent years, I found myself revisiting Temple of Doom the most, and it wasn't until I began to understand the story of how it got made that I truly appreciated the beautiful anomaly that is this second Indiana Jones adventure. When Lucas first approached Spielberg with the idea for Indiana Jones, he told Spielberg that if he directed the first one, he would have to direct the next two, rounding out a trilogy. Lucas also assured Spielberg that he had mapped out the entire story for the trilogy, and in the words of Spielberg himself,
it turned out George did not have 3 stories in mind. We had to make up all the other subsequent stories. So it was like 2 weeks after Raiders opened that we knew we were going to have to sit down in the room and figure out what Raiders 2 was going to be.
But did Spielberg back out? Of course not. He made a pact with his friend, shook his hand, and was going to see this one through. However, the road ahead was filled with turmoil and uncertainty, both in Spielberg and Lucas's personal lives and in creating a follow-up to Raiders. During the filming of Empire Strikes Back, Lucas insisted Irvin Kershner make a darker second act before the Star Wars saga's inevitable triumphant conclusion. Naturally, he wanted to take that same approach to Indiana Jones, something even Spielberg wasn't sure about. I think Temple of Doom was ahead of its time for my own sensibility, said Spielberg during an interview with Empire, and exactly right on schedule for George's. George was going through a dark period. Indeed, this wasn't the best of times for Lucas, as he was going through a nasty divorce during Temple of Doom's production, resulting in his disgruntled mental state seeping its way into the subconscious of his filmmaking. That being said, even Spielberg was going through a breakup at the time, resulting in a film that crossed the threshold of darkness they were initially aiming for. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that much of Doom's brutality and mean-spiritedness is the direct result of 2 young, pissed-off filmmakers with bad attitudes and bad moods ready to unleash their inner edgelords. Obviously, a filmmaker's mental state reflecting the art they create isn't exactly something new. However, what's always fascinated me about Temple of Doom is the notion of 2 of the biggest names in blockbuster filmmaking creating a wholly unrestrained and cathartic sequel to one of the biggest franchise starters of all time. Lucas and Spielberg knew they had to shake things up for a sequel, but even they never intended to go as far as they did.
I think we went darker than any of us really wanted to go. But you're in the middle of it and you're doing things, and it's a matter of what you do every moment.
The cynicism of toxic relationships permeates throughout the entirety of Doom, both literally and figuratively. The genuine and heartwarming relationship between Indy and Marion Ravenwood is nowhere to be seen in this bachelor's paradise. Indy is far less interested in meaningful relationships and instead adopts a somewhat playboy persona. Both Indy and Willie Scott's interest in one another is purely sexual and allows the filmmakers to have some fun with it. The whole will they, won't they hookup scene that takes place inside the palace is a horny screwball comedy aimed directly at more mature viewers. The 2 filmmakers are well aware of the outdated and embarrassingly shallow portrait of women in these serials and exploit it. They also clearly had some disdain towards their former lovers, and were able to get that out of their system here. In fact, due to its relentless pace, snarky attitude, and loud narrative voice, Temple of Doom feels as though Spielberg and Lucas are passive-aggressively ranting to the audience. Many view that as off-putting, and I can absolutely understand that, but I absolutely adore its brashness and find the whole thing fascinating. And through that, you can see pretty easily why Spielberg and Lucas cringe at the thought of this film and look upon it less fondly than their other Indiana Jones excursions.
You know, of all the Raider Indy films, Temple of Doom is my least favorite. I mean, I look back on Temple of Doom and I say, well, the greatest thing that I got out of that movie was I met Kate Capshaw, and we were married years later, and that, to me, was the reason I think it was fated that I make Temple of Doom. And so even though Indiana Jones wound up getting the girl, I really did.
It also just so happens that Doom is strategically structured to emulate the mental stages of a breakup. It revels in the gluttony of ego, only to take a sharp left turn, spiraling into the anger and despair of losing the love you once had, before ultimately finding the light at the end of the tunnel. And in this particular case, that is quite literal. Indy's entanglement with the Thuggees is a literal descent into hell that truthfully reflects Lucas's relationship troubles more than Spielberg's, who conceded that even he got to a point where he was uncomfortable with the darkness of the film. It's well documented how nasty George Lucas's divorce to Marcia Lucas was, and to maintain a positive public image, the two agreed to keep the separation private until after Return of the Jedi was released. When the dust settled, Marcia was awarded $50 million and given joint custody over their adopted daughter, Amanda Lucas. Naturally, as I'm sure you can imagine, all of that bottled up emotion had to find its way out of George somehow, and thus was cathartically incorporated into Temple of Doom. Marcia cited George's workaholism and emotional blockage as a key reason for their separation. When exploring the horrific Thuggee ritual, and more specifically, the blood of the collie, we're given a peek into the mental state of Lucas. He feels blindsided by the matter, as though his heart has literally been ripped from his chest, and the worst part about it was that he had no say in the matter. It was a decision Marcia came to on her own. Like George, when Indy is forced to drink the blood of the collie, he does so against his will, losing all autonomy and falling into a black sleep of powerlessness. It's only once he's rescued by Short Round that he awakens from the slumber, another callback to George's own life. As previously mentioned, George and Marcia adopted Amanda Lucas in 1981, right before the onset of their relationship troubles. It's clear that while going through such a tumultuous time, George's beacon of hope, his salvation, if you will, his light at the end of the tunnel, was his daughter, and more specifically, his paternal instincts. George loved being a father and incorporated that aspect into one of Indy's most important relationships in the entire franchise, he and Short Round. From the moment we're introduced to Indy's lovable and quippy sidekick, we get a sense of the relationship between the two adventurers. Short Round adores Indy and follows his lead in more ways than not, whether it be mimicking a sitting position, hand gesture, hat placement, wailing on goons, whatever, but he also represents Indy's morality manifested. Shorty is pure of heart and encompasses the very best of our titular hero, just as most parents hope to pass on the best of themselves into their children. Even when Indy is consumed by darkness and all hope seems lost, Shorty never loses faith and, out of love, manages to restore Indy's humanity. It's also at that moment that Indy's paternal responsibility kicks in as he proceeds to free the child slaves from captivity. Not only does Short Round save Indy from the Thuggee control, but he reshapes Indy's beliefs, a vital character transformation we're definitely going to get to later on. This is very representative of Lucas finding new purpose in fatherhood following the fallout of his divorce, subsequently adopting 2 more children as a single parent. This beautiful collision of personal catharsis and blockbuster storytelling is about the only time we get a sneak peek into the artist behind these titans of pop culture. With Temple of Doom, it was also important for Lucas to be a bit more experimental and darker. They had the padding and success of the first film, so Lucas wanted to use that to take bold and ambitious risks with the second. The danger in making a sequel is that you can never satisfy everyone. If you give people the same movie with different scenes, they say, "Why weren't you more original?" But if you give them the same character in another fantastic adventure but with a different tone, you risk disappointing the other half of the audience who just wanted a carbon copy of the first film with a different girl and a different bad guy. So you win and you lose both ways. The fact that Indiana Jones wasn't a 3-movie story and more so an episodic tale allowed Lucas and Spielberg to take their experimentation to the next level. While Raiders of the Lost Ark was undoubtedly inspired by the classic Republic serials I mentioned earlier, it wasn't solely indebted to them. The film is actually a balanced concoction of James Bond, classic Hollywood sweeping romantic adventures like Treasure of Sierra Madre, Casablanca, and films of that nature, and those Republic serials. There's a sort of class and elegance those previously mentioned works possessed that Spielberg and Lucas incorporated into Raiders, making it far more accessible. Temple of Doom, however, is a more direct translation of those old Republic serials, and at times comments on the tropes associated with them. More on that later. These serials, much like Indiana Jones, were episodic in nature, often confined to a single location and presented as a day in the life of an adventurer, something Temple of Doom very much emulates. Outside of the James Bondian Shanghai opening, which I must admit beautifully kickstarts the brisk pace of this film, the entire movie takes place over the course of a day, maybe 2, and our heroes spend a majority of their time stranded in one location, Pankot Palace. But it doesn't stop there. Out of all the Indiana Jones adventures, Temple of Doom is without question the pulpiest. There was an element of swashbuckling spectacle that separated Republic serials from traditional adventure cinema, something Raiders and Last Crusade incorporated safely. However, when it came to Doom, Spielberg and Lucas were willing to push the envelope slightly, seeing just how much they could get away with using from the more absurdist side of those serials. A gamble people clearly weren't willing to accept, hence why Spielberg used Last Crusade as his apology tour. While many filmmakers and storytellers revere classic pulp fiction, there's no denying it's viewed as lowbrow literature or entertainment. They were racy, almost forbidden, action-based tales that often indulged in their fair share of exploitation and exoticism. However, there were also films in the genre that sought to challenge the tropes and notion of a traditional serial, which is precisely what Spielberg and Lucas wanted to focus on with Temple of Doom.
If you think of those movies from the 30s and Republic serials from the 30s, they take themselves a little bit more serious. But at the same time, there's all these sort of Abbott and Costello movies and kind of Laurel and Hardy and sort of The Thin Man. There's all these kind of movies that are sort of upbeat, which is what we wanted to infuse in Raiders, and which I had done in Star Wars. And so there's this kind of goofy 30s humor going on through the whole thing.
Ah, sneak surprise.
What's the surprise?
Temple of Doom is far more clever and self-aware than people give it credit for. Spielberg and Lucas brilliantly utilized the Abbott and Costello model as an entry point to take jabs at the tropes of the serials they revere and exercise their own personal demons. The blend, as I'm sure you can imagine, is somewhat juvenile and mean-spirited.
And I think that scene at the dinner table does sort of capture that spirit. I mean, we did have a lot of fun discussing it because it was, let's sit around just thinking the most horrible things you could think of, but it's done very tongue-in-cheek.
There are a few ways you could view the dinner table exposition scene. One, you could view it as Spielberg and, by extension, the Indians in Pankot Palace wanting to torment the obnoxious foreigners with a gross meal that plays into the equally as gross and inaccurate stereotypes associated with non-Western culture often depicted in these old serials. Or two, an elaborate clue that something was amiss in the palace. The meal was prepared and served by supposed Hindus, and as Indy states in an unused line from the script, even if they were trying to scare us away, a devout Hindu would never touch meat. Makes you wonder what these people are. The fact that this palace would serve such a twisted meal while exposition regarding the Thuggee cult was divulged implies that something far sinister is afoot. Either way, while it's easy to see how some can view it as offensive, I think it's clear that Spielberg had a bit more on his mind. It also just so happens that George always wanted to do a scene like that, and Spielberg had the perfect sense of humor to pull it off. Spielberg's always enjoyed creeping out others and was very much the younger brother who loved pranking his sisters. The film's overall darker tone gave them permission to poke fun at themselves and have a scene that leaned into gross-out comedy, putting Spielberg's immature meanness on full display. However, the self-awareness doesn't stop there. During the filming of Raiders, Spielberg and Lucas conceived of far too many action set pieces and thus had to put some of them in their back pocket for a later time. By the time Temple of Doom was given the go-ahead, Spielberg was already hard at work thinking of ways to incorporate the leftover set pieces from Raiders. These sequences included the Shanghai fight, the raft escape from the airplane, and the iconic minecart chase. When Raiders first hit theaters, many of the critics lauded it as an exhilarating action-adventure or an e-ticket ride, like at Disneyland or something of that nature. Spielberg and Lucas found this notion amusing, and so, cheekily, they had some fun with the critics and gave them a literal roller coaster or e-ticket ride with the minecart chase that gets them out of the darkness. In addition to Temple of Doom cheekily subverting the genre tropes, Indy's character arc is a far more earnest deconstruction of the hero's journey in these serials. These works would often depict archaeology through the lens of a white colonizer who would, for all intent and purposes, pillage historical artifacts for personal gain. Spielberg and Lucas challenged that notion by creating an arc for Indy that started him at a place of arrogance and shallow desires, offering him a profitable thrill ride in the process. He's not quite the good-natured academic that we know from Raiders, and views archaeology as the quest for fortune and glory, a line that brilliantly juxtaposes Jones's occupational outlook in his subsequent journeys in Raiders and Last Crusade, in the latter of which he says,
"So forget any ideas you got about lost cities, exotic travel, and digging up the world. We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot."
Doom opens with Indy having just raided a Chinese temple in order to sell the relic back to the people it belongs to. Granted, in this case, those people are gangsters, but the logic still tracks. It's only through the journey that follows that our hero learns humility. Every Indiana Jones adventure has some sort of MacGuffin or relic that Jones has to retrieve. However, while Raiders and Last Crusade place significant emphasis on that MacGuffin, Temple of Doom doesn't dwell on it too much. The Sankara Stones aren't explored all that much and don't really tie into the thematic undertones either. We only know that they're valuable, have supernatural abilities, and are of great importance to the people of the village, hence why they plead and beg with Indy to retrieve them. What makes Doom such a strong outing for Jones is that the entire film is more concerned with his experiences inside the temple, and how those experiences challenge the white colonizer outlook on archaeology, and forever alter Indy's outlook on his occupation. When presented with the same scenario as the opening, he refuses to profiteer off the local inhabitants and understands the Sankara Stones belong with them. When Indy says,
"I understand its power now,"
he's not only referring to the reformation of his beliefs, but he finally understands the moral obligation of archaeology instead of the egotistical viewpoint of fortune and glory. Temple of Doom is so integral in understanding who Indiana Jones is as a person, and offers perhaps the most transformative and effective arc as a character. These experiences in this prequel inform the kind of person he is when we meet him in Raiders, and it becomes more apparent as to why exactly he resents Belloc. It's because Belloc is precisely the kind of self-aggrandizing archaeologist he was before undergoing his epiphany. Few films can match the Temple of Doom when it comes to sheer audacity, wit, excitement, and catharsis, all operating equally on full cylinders. You couldn't ask for a more contrasting follow-up to one of the most beloved blockbusters of all time. It's cheeky, self-aware, smart, juvenile, mean-spirited, breakneck, graphic, disturbing, nightmarish, and most importantly, risky. Temple of Doom is the truest attempt at the pulpy adventure serials that inspired Indiana Jones, viewed through the lens of 80s excess. In the words of George Lucas, ripping someone's heart out had been done before. Child slavery and violence had been done before. They just did it better, which is what made it even more intense, leading to the creation of the PG-13 rating. It's packed full of jaw-dropping sequences, from the fever dream Thuggee ritual to the minecart chase to the final showdown on the bridge featuring Harrison Ford at his sexiest. It was ballsy and unabashedly the product of a specific period in both Lucas's and Spielberg's life. While the constant ranting and impish nature of the project is often scoffed at, it's what gives the film its personality, and something that should be admired in an age where franchise filmmakers err on the side of safety. Temple of Doom doesn't care about a connected universe or direct tie-ins to its predecessor. It's not the product of a studio, but the artists hired to tell a story. It's utterly brilliant and one of the most quirky and ambitious left turns in the history of franchise filmmaking. A rare instance where a tentpole blockbuster actually sought to tell us more about the auteurs behind the camera. Thank you all so much for checking out this video. I have wanted to talk about Temple of Doom for a long time, and this director's project really, it was the push I needed to write this very beefy essay, praise, love letter to the film that happens to be my favorite Indiana Jones film of all time. I don't know why. Maybe this says something more about me than it does, the films itself. But this video has been a real labor of love, so please, if you enjoyed what I had to say, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, even if they've never seen Temple of Doom or they think that that movie is bad, show them this video, and maybe they'll wind up liking it, who knows. And then also, be sure to comment down below and let me know what your favorite Indiana Jones film is and why. That should be a great discussion. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the FilmSpeak channel for more insight, analysis, and interviews behind your favorite movies. Again, guys, be sure to check out the playlist right over there for the rest of the Spielberg deep dives for this month's director's project. Seriously, everyone did a bang-up job, so go check it out and support the collaboration. And lastly, if you like me specifically and you like what I have to say, you can give me a follow on Twitter at Griff Schiller. All right, guys, that's gonna do it for this essay, and hopefully I'll be back next month with another exciting one for you. But until then, take care.